Please join me in welcoming Michael Backman.
Thank you very much, Angela. There's an awful lot of you here, and art dealing and art history is such a huge topic, so I could talk for hours, but I think as almost a sign of mercy to you, I won't. But what I'll do instead is to focus on how dealers protect cultural artefacts and how dealers interact with museums. I'll also talk about the growing problem of provenance with respect to museums and their acquisitions. Now, a lot of nonsense is often said about dealers and the whole dealing profession. If you tell someone that you deal in antiques, particularly Asian antiques, they often assume that you're involved in smuggling or looting. It's often assumed that the only way an item has found its way to the West from Asia or from Africa is because it was stolen or it was looted. Why is there this perception? Why have the practices of just a few in this profession tainted the whole, tainted the rest? Now, antiques and art, and even art history, tend to be associated with the middle classes and the wealthy, and it's my contention that the subcurrent of the attacks on dealing and collecting are essentially ideologically driven and relate to an old-fashioned left-wing dislike for private property, the wealthy, and those who collect. Increasingly, museum administrators, particularly in the US, have contributed to this problem, often to the horror of curators. The increasingly draconian provenance requirements of US museums, what I would term sort of like almost a provenance fascism, as well as attacks on the ownership of antique ivory, even when it's many hundreds of years old, are part of this ideologically driven attack on dealing and collecting. This sort of dislike of ownership of cultural artefacts and cultural property and the trade in these items. Now, increasingly, objects with incomplete provenance are assumed without any evidence whatsoever to be stolen or looted. Objects are deemed to be guilty until they are proven innocent. Rather than protecting our cultural heritage, this perception is harming it. And when I say our, I mean all of us, because cultural artefacts belong to us all. In this century of high mobility and migration, where the linkage between your place of ancestry and your place of residency grows ever more tenuous, multicultural cities deserve encyclopedic multicultural museums. Now, if the Elgin marbles, I mean, we've always been thrashed to death about the Elgin marbles, but if the Elgin marbles belong to the Greek people, then that's fine. Let's send some of them to Melbourne in Australia, because that's that has the world's third biggest population of Greeks outside of Athens and Thessaloniki. Now, the discomfort that some have with the ownership of cultural artefacts also seems in part to me to come from this whole sort of sorry culture that has engulfed the West in recent years, whereby we project our own insecurities onto others so that they become targets for our pity and our apology. Sometimes this is valid, but often it's not. So the great ideological battle between the right and the left, capitalism and socialism, it's been fought out and it's been won. It's been won by the right, essentially. But there's one area left, it seems to me, where the fight over the right to property and ownership continues to occur, and that's in the area of cultural property. Of course, these rights are not absolute. There are some very necessary restrictions. For example, as far as I'm concerned, the trade in fresh ivory is utterly disgusting, as is the trade in freshly stolen and looted objects. One of the things I hate most to see as a dealer is when people present the struts from the Kathmandu Valley, the struts from temples and so on, which hold up the roofs. They pull them out and try and sell them, which cause the roofs to fall. That is just reprehensible. But in terms of trying to control the bad aspects of the antiques and antiquities trade, I would contend that we have gone way too far, and that museums have gone too far in their requirements for proof of provenance. Now, it's interesting how the term dealer has taken on negative connotations. I can think of only one type of dealer, another type of dealer, and that's probably the drug dealer. Dealers in contemporary art have managed to relabel themselves as gallerists. Even book dealers now are booksellers. Now, of course, some dealers have contributed to looting and antiquity smuggling, but there are wrongdoers in all professions. I mean, there are academics who fabricate their survey results to get published, but that doesn't mean that all academics do that. Dealers help to create markets for many old items that otherwise would be thrown away, and they bring back to life items that have been lost or forgotten. Let me explain how this operates by describing what we do in our gallery and how we operate. From our premises, which are very central, just off of Regent Street, we specialise in Asian, colonial and tribal art. Now this specialisation is driven very much by UK provenance. Almost all of our stock comes from old collections here in the UK, although sometimes the immediate provenance of an item can be obscured if, for example, it passes through an auction house. The UK colonised much of the world, and from that we're very fortunate to have an enormous pool of items here in the UK to be found. Now there are people all over the country who might have had, say, a grandfather in India or an uncle in Malaya and so on. And they were not all dragging back the organ marbles. They weren't all dragging back things they should have been. Most of these people were bringing back small ethnographic souvenirs, things that were sold, I emphasise sold, to them by local people. Much of the material here now, which came in this fashion, is often underappreciated or misunderstood. It's hiding away in people's houses and so on. And very often when it does appear in the marketplace, it's miscatalogued, often even by the big auction houses. And so a big part of what we do here, in my gallery and in other galleries, is we locate these objects, we research them, we give them the correct attribution, and then we offer them to museums and private collectors around the world. So essentially, rather than destroying cultural artifacts and so on, we're bringing them back into circulation. We're bringing back into circulation lost and forgotten and misattributed objects. So that's what good dealers do. Now, I deal in Asian art, but I never go on buying trips to Asia, and I'm often very annoyed when people think that I do. If I travel to Asia, it usually is to eat, obviously, and to go to museums and so on, but we never source from source countries. There are various reasons for this. We like the colonial provenance of UK items. The items that are here, they're not tampered with usually. The Brits keep them tucked away and don't try and embellish them or change them and so on. Their condition is often better here because the climate is quite benevolent. There are not many pests and there's not much humidity and so on, so textiles and all sorts of things like that are kept better. And finally, it's usually illegal to take things out of countries like India and Indonesia and so on. So it's simply not worth the hassle, that there's enough here to be found. Now the London Chinese art dealer Giuseppe Eskenazi is very well known. He recalls in his memoirs a speech given by Sherman Lee, the legendary director of the Cleveland Museum of Art. Now Lee said in a speech, when a curator comes back from a trip and says, "Look what I have found," I say to him, "Remember, a dealer found it before you." Now that is very true. Much of the finding that dealers do, good dealers do, is underpinned by copious research. Now we are dealers, but we are more than that. We are researchers, essentially. I spend almost every working day researching objects and then writing them up. So if I had to explain what I did all day, I wouldn't say, "Oh, I'm a dealer." Really, I'm a researcher and a curator. So a good dealer really is a curator and a researcher, and in many instances often can know more than, say, many museum people do, simply because of the volume of the material they handle, and because they're risking their own money all the time. But perhaps the main difference between museum curators and good dealers is that one is paid by the taxpayer. That's quite a difference. And another difference is that museum curators especially in this country, are remarkably poorly paid. In my view, this could be another speech, but in my view, museums here should start charging entrance fees, and that money should go straight to the curators because they're simply not paid enough. So books are very important to what we do. The library that we have in our gallery encompasses probably thousands of books and periodicals. Now, yeah, this is an image of a part of our library, so you can see there's a lot of books and so on. You can see Regent Street just through the window, out the corner. Now, knowledge and learning are so essential to being a good dealer. And to emphasise this, we list all of the books that we have on our website. And a good dealer should have a lot of books. And I'm very mindful of a famous American tribal art collector who said that the first thing you should do when you go into a gallery is to see how many books a dealer has. And if you don't see many books, you should leave. You shouldn't buy. Now, it's important for dealers to travel as well, to go overseas, to visit museums, to go to temples and things like that, and also to see the cultural context of the objects that you're dealing in. And as Angela alluded to, one of the most satisfying things that we do in the gallery is when we rescue lost or misidentified objects and then we place them in museums. I love doing that. Sometimes it's easier to sell to private people because they pay quickly, a lot more quickly, and probably more. But it's more satisfying, I think, to put something into a museum. So, as Angela suggested, in the last 4 years alone, we've sold around 87 objects to around 15 different public museums in America, Europe, and Asia. More broadly, we've sold around 2,000 objects during that period. And probably most of these objects have been in the hands of families or auctioneers and so on, who did not fully understand what they had. Now, to illustrate this, what I'll do now is to show you several objects that we've handled in the last few years. Most of these are now in public museums. The first object it's a silver bowl. It's about this big. It's the size of a punch bowl. It's silver. And this object was circulating in the London antiques trade for several years. No one really seemed to know what it was. I spotted it. In fact, when I saw it, it was in someone's wardrobe. And I sort of said, "Oh my God, what are you doing with that?" Anyway, so I bought it and I researched it. And we identified it as it's a very rare memorial Nukta bowl for the Parsi community in Bombay. Now, this thing's probably been floating around in the UK for decades, if not longer. It's a very rare thing, and with the correct identification, we were able to sell this item to the Asian Art Museum in San Francisco. I'm really pleased about that because the Parsis are such a rare group, and they're practically dying out. There's only about 120,000 Parsis left. So it was wonderful to be able to have this with the museum. I think they now keep it on permanent display in its own case. The next object is a comb that we found last year, and it came from an elderly lady's collection. I think she passed away when she was 90, and she lived in Worcestershire. She built up a collection over her lifetime. And then at her estate sale, it was catalogued as a 19th century Indian ivory comb. But when I spotted it, I did actually know with this one right away that it was quite a rare 17th century comb produced in Sri Lanka. And actually it's one of the finest examples of its type. And we sold it right away. We sold it to the Rydberg Museum in Zurich. The back of it, that's the back. It still retains a lot of polychrome and so on. Most of the other ones that are available in museums today have the combs, or the teeth are broken, and there's no polychrome left. So this is a splendid example. But I don't know where this lady got this comb from. So I can't say that I know where it has been since before 1970, which is what a lot of museums would require. So without that incomplete provenance, a lot of museums in the US would have refused to take it. But quite obviously, it's been here for a long, long time. Now the next thing popped up in a sort of similar fashion. This is a very long Indian tent panel. It's about 7 metres long, hence the weird photograph, the weird angle. Now, I spotted this in an auction out in the country somewhere, some small regional auction house, and it was described as a West African textile. And in fact, what it is an 18th century Indian tent hanging. Several museums wanted this, but in the end we decided to give it to the Art Gallery of South Australia. They had an exhibition coming up, and in fact they included it in the exhibition. That's one of the panels. You can see it's quite Mughal influenced and so on. The condition of this is marvellous, actually, for its age and for the material. And again, that's one of the beauties of finding itself in this country when it comes to textiles, because they're often quite well preserved because of the lack of pests and the lack of humidity. And there it is. That's how it looks in the exhibition in South Australia, in Adelaide. They had it as their final item as you went through the exhibition. The next item I got from a really good dealer here in London. She's actually sitting over in the corner. I went to her Chelsea flat and she showed me this thing. And we weren't really sure at the time where it was from, but and it's quite big. It was about this big, marvellous thing. And it had come from a private collection. And after some research, we realised it was a reliquary stupa from Sri Lanka, and it's made entirely of silver. And what's so interesting is that when you take the lid off, you get that, and the thing you can see in the middle there on the left-hand side is a flower. It's a lotus flower made entirely of silver. And in the middle, you would just flip open the stamens, and that was the reliquary chamber, perhaps for some monk's ashes or something like that. Now this is now on display, I think on permanent display in the National Gallery of Australia. So again, it popped up in Chelsea. It's been here for a long time, and we were able to give it the right attribution and then sell it to a museum. The next object is another item that has popped up in a regional sale. It was catalogued as an Indian scroll, but in fact it's a Northern Thai Vesantara Jataka narrative scroll. Now this was 36 metres long, almost complete. And I mean, if one is being entirely commercial, you really wouldn't buy this, because who on earth has room for a 36 metre long scroll? For those who are not from Australia like me, 36 metres is 120 feet. I don't know what that means, but I know what 36 metres is. But it was so long that, in fact, I never got to see it unrolled in its entirety, because in central London we had nowhere to unroll it. Anyway, so, but it popped up, it was miscatalogued, and I thought I must buy that. I wanted to save it, because I thought if I don't buy that, someone else will, and they will cut it up into little pieces and sell each piece by piece. So I bought it, and I had it for quite some time, and then eventually someone from the Tropper Museum came, and now it's with the Tropper Museum, and they're in the process of buying it. So I was terribly pleased about that, because it's something that popped up in God knows where, somewhere outside of London. And I hoped that I'd be able to place it with the museum, so that's where it's gone. The next item I count as one of my favourite finds. There's no particular reason other than that I really like it, and it's gone to Singapore. And again, it was described simply as an oriental box. And in fact, it's a fairly early 19th century Thai betel nut box. It's lacquered and it's inlaid with mother of pearl. And the reason why I was really excited when I saw this was because of the topographical scenes of the Chao Phraya River in Bangkok. You can almost identify where it is by the buildings and so on. And also because it shows European sailing ships. And I love, along with Asian sailing ships and so on, I love that sort of cross-cultural mix of ships. So I showed it to the director from the museum in Singapore, and by the way, he just said, "Oh, we'll have that." And I was really pleased because it's gone to the right place. So again, it had been in the UK, probably in someone's house, underappreciated. No one probably at the time really knew what it was, and we've now been able to get it and place it in a museum. The next item is a very similar situation. Now this popped up at, oh sorry, that's just another scene at the top of the box. Again, you can see right in the middle of the wooden sailing ship. It's the only time a ship like this, as far as I know, has ever appeared on any Thai mother-of-pearl work. So it's a very rare thing. Now, the next item. This has also gone to the same museum in Singapore. This was auctioned at Bonhams in Bond Street, and they catalogued it as Indian, but in fact it's not. They catalogued it as 19th century Indian, but in fact it's 18th century Dutch colonial from Batavia, which is the old name for what's now Jakarta. The bottles inside, first of all you can see it's like a rosewood box, and the mounts are silver. And what makes this particularly from Batavia are these cloud-like, stylized cloud motifs around the corners and so on. That's terribly symptomatic of this period, Chinese influenced silverwork from Batavia. And inside it had bottles, the decanter bottles, which were probably made in Gujarat. So the VOC, the Dutch East India Company, commissioned some bottles from Gujarat, transshipped them to Batavia, had the box made, and then sent the lot probably back to Europe for sale in the 18th century. So it's a fabulous example of early 18th century cross-cultural trade and so on. Like I said, it's now in the Asian Civilizations Museum in Singapore. And again, it was miscatalogued very badly by Bonhams in Bond Street. Now, the last image I'll show of an object is this one. Yeah, I like that sound. I'd like to say that we still have it, so if anyone's interested. But now this was a fabulous thing because someone rang me, or no, they emailed me from America, and he said, look, I'm a valuer. We have a client who's come in, and she says she's been told this is a 19th century filigree box. I think it could be earlier. What do you think? So I said, well, it's definitely 17th or maybe early 18th century. It's either from India or from Batavia. And on top of that, I said, I can't really say what it's worth, but this is what I'll give you for it. And it obviously was more than they were expecting because I practically bit my hand off. And so they then shipped it or FedExed it to us immediately. And I was able to identify as almost a spitting image of one in the British Museum. When you open this up, this is what it looks like inside. You've got little silver gilt, it's shaking, little silver gilt perfume bottles, and the tray and so on. Now, okay, I'm missing an image. The British Museum has one just like this on display. And that one, the provenance for that is allegedly it's come from the palace in Seringapatam, which was Tipu Sultan's palace. And and it is very similar to this example. The only difference between this one really and the Seringapatam Tipu Sultan one is that ours has a tray. And so we were able to demonstrate that probably the British Museum example is missing a tray. But theirs actually does have a funnel, which ours doesn't, but then ours has no space for a funnel. This is for mixing the perfume and so on. Okay. Yeah, so this, several weeks ago, I was in South India, again not buying, just eating and looking. The only thing I brought back were 3,000 photographs. This is one of them. This is what's left of Tipu Sultan's palace on the island at Seringapatam after the British taught him a lesson. So there's not a lot at all, but that's where the BM's box has come from, and possibly where ours has come from as well. So all of these objects, apart from that last one, the box, are all now in museums, but it's getting more and more difficult to sell to museums on account of this incomplete provenance problem. Much of the Asian art that we have in the UK has obviously, like very obviously, been here for decades or much longer. But proving that without documentation is often difficult. So rare and fabulous things can well turn up at car boot sales or regional auctions and estate auctions, and it's usually impossible to find out all the provenance details to satisfy some museums, particularly American museums, but this problem is growing. But why should a great object that tells us something really very interesting about the past be condemned because it turned up in a car boot sale without its provenance being very clear, or because the 90-year-old lady who owned it is now dead and she can't tell us where she got it from. Now, we sell to museums, but we also sell a lot, obviously, to private collectors. And too often today, private collectors are viewed also with suspicion in the same way that dealers are. But the course of art history owes much to private collecting. Many of the world's great museums are only great, really, because private collectors amassed extraordinary collections and then gave them to a museum. James Staunton, in his really good book, it's called Great Collectors of Our Time, provides collecting biographies of dozens of important private collectors around the world since 1945. Their scholarship and their curating has added immeasurably to the course of art history. The Met, the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York, has been the beneficiary of thousands of objects from private collectors. 3,000 items, for example, were donated by Nelson Rockefeller, and Robert Lehman, another businessman, gave another 2,600. It goes on and on and on. Now, we refer to these individuals as collectors, but of course they are curators who happen to own what they curate. It's their scholarship and their donations that make most of the museums that we love, worth going to. Right now, the British Museum in room 2 has a wonderful display about collectors and what they've donated to the British Museum. It has often pictures of them next to the objects that they've given. It's a wonderful reminder of how important private collectors are to public museums. Now, we all love museums, even Shimon, my son, but they do not exist for their own sake. They are charged with collecting and preserving cultural property on our behalf, and in this regard, they are our servants, they are our agents. Perhaps the biggest threat today to the preservation of cultural property going forward are the museums themselves, particularly in the US, because increasingly, with their insistence on proof of provenance going back before 1970, it's making it harder to sell to them. The rules derive from the UN's 1970 Convention on the Means of Prohibiting and Preventing the Illicit Import, Export and Transfer of Ownership of Cultural Property. But remember, the UN is all about nation states, it's not about cultures. So it only works if nation states are a good proxy for cultures, but of course they're not. Let me provide just one example of the operation of the rules in this country with respect to the British Library. Clause 10 of the British Library's Ethical Future Acquisitions Policy states, quote, "The policy of the British Library is to refuse to acquire items that have been illegally excavated and or illegally exported from their countries of origin since 1970. The general expectation should be that the British Library will only consider the acquisition of antiquities and archaeological items exported from their country of origin before 1970, where proper documentation can be provided. Exceptionally, where such documentation does not exist, as is sometimes the case, the board reserves the right for the library's curatorial staff to exercise their best judgment as to whether to recommend such an item for purchase or inward loan." Okay, that sounds all right. In such circumstances, the British Library would require the vendor or the donor to provide a signed written statement confirming the circumstances behind the object being offered to the British Library, and may in some cases demand a sworn affidavit to that effect. Now, the problem arises in just how stringently such rules are applied, and it usually depends on who's in charge. So sometimes the British Library might want to take something, and then suddenly there can be a change in personnel, and suddenly they don't want that sort of thing anymore. There's a lot of discretion. Now, one problem with this sort of approach is in this country there are hundreds and possibly thousands of palm leaf manuscripts from Burma, Sri Lanka and India, which were acquired by the British and the Scots and so on during the colonial era, and they were brought back to Britain at that time as little keepsakes, souvenirs and so on. These often turn up at country auctions and in car boot sales without any provenance and usually with a description as bland as an Eastern manuscript or something like that, an Oriental document. Clearly, these have not been smuggled into the UK in recent years because no one would bother commercially, and I can tell you, commercially, these are almost worthless. But culturally, many of these are really important and worth protecting. So it would be absolutely appalling, it would be quite a tragedy if the British Library stopped acquiring these because provenance prior to 1970 could not be established. You just have to use your common sense to know that these items have been here for decades and have not been smuggled under any circumstances. Because again, it just isn't worth it commercially. Now, the British Library is here to protect literary heritage and not be a party to its loss, which of course is what it will be if it overzealously applies this 1970 rule. Now, of course, it's very important that artworks are not stolen, but that's what the various stolen art registries are for. So that's quite adequate to look at provenance, to establish provenance and so on. Now, as a dealer who has an interest in common sense, there's nothing more dispiriting than having to detail the provenance for the benefit, say, of the US Museum of, say, a silver teapot that was made in India for the British market, so that the museum can be sure that it has been outside India since 1970. Just last week, a museum in Chicago, that almost identifies which one it was, asked me to detail, I'm so annoyed, asked me to detail the provenance of an Indian tea caddy that was made for the 19th century British market. The only reason why the caddy exists was for export. But they're wanting me to demonstrate its provenance, presumably back to 1970. It's a ridiculous exercise. Particularly, as I said, by definition, such items were made for export. They shouldn't even be in India. That's their point. The UN Convention was conceived to protect the likes of Angkor Wat. It was not designed to inhibit the free movement of teapots. This whole thing is nothing more than a form of bureaucratic function creep, whereby the original intent has been extended and extended and extended, and no one seems able to stop it. Of course, the rules are most stringently applied to archaeological material, and archaeologists have been very successful at pushing the notion that objects that become separated from their archaeological context have no value whatsoever. Professor Colin Renfrew, the distinguished archaeologist formerly at the University of Cambridge, has been quoted to say that antiquities separated from their context of discovery, i.e. they're no longer in the dirt, have very little potential to add to our knowledge of the past. Now, of course, that's absolute rubbish. In some respects, the archaeologists who promote this extreme view are just another self-interested lobby group whose prime concern is to protect their own livelihoods and to create a demand for their own services. And I understand why they would do that, because they're largely taxpayer funded. Very often, objects speak for themselves. An art historian can tell a lot by looking at an object, even if an archaeologist can't. It's true that sometimes archaeological context can tell us about an item, but of course, as James Cuno says in Whose Culture, a volume that he edited, it's an excellent volume, in many instances the archaeological context tells us little or nothing. Too often, unless an item can be shown to their provenance prior to 1970, as I've said, it's assumed to be stolen or looted. And too often, non-archaeological items are being treated as if they're archaeological when it comes to the application of rules by museums. As I said earlier, objects are assumed to be guilty unless they can be proven to be innocent. This perverse logic, as I mentioned before, it's a form of provenance fascism. Every item is under suspicion until proven otherwise. But of course, there is no such thing as a guilty object, just guilty people. The objects themselves are culturally valuable no matter what their provenance might be. For a museum to reject an item, not because it was stolen or looted, but because no one can find proof of where the object has been year on year for the last 45 years, is itself a crime. Perhaps it's time to reverse this perverse onus of proof that objects should be assumed to have satisfactory provenance unless it can be shown otherwise. Maybe objects should be seen as innocent until proven stolen or looted. But then who should own cultural artefacts anyway? Princeton University's Kwame Appiah says in James Kuno's volume in relation to ancient sculptures of the Nok people of northern Nigeria, we don't know whether Nok sculptures were commissioned by kings or commoners. We don't know whether the people who made them and the people who paid for them thought of them as belonging to the kingdom, to a man, to a lineage, or to the gods. But one thing we know for sure, however, is that they didn't make them for Nigeria. Now, the logical extension of Appiah's argument is that Nigeria, by claiming Nok cultural artefacts for itself, is itself committing a form of cultural theft. By this measure, what claim has India and its National Museum in Delhi to chola bronzes produced in the Dravidian South, 1,000 years before the nation-state of India was ever thought of? Does New Delhi have a greater claim to chola bronzes than, say, a museum in New York? Now, there are more than 3 million people of Indian descent living in the United States. So if Indian art belongs to the Indian people, then on that basis alone, American museums are well within their rights to own and display at least some cultural artefacts from India in the South. When artists create, they create for all of humanity, and very often they create with an eye to making a living. Caravaggio did not paint for Italy. One reason, of course, is because when he was alive, Italy didn't exist. Why did he paint? Well, he painted to make money. You could read Caravaggio by the hour, practically, which is the truth about most artisans in most cultures throughout history. They personally were not creating for their society, their culture, or to honour their gods. They were creating to earn a living. Their patrons might have had loftier intentions, but the artisans usually did not. Now, if you told a woodcarver in the Sepik region of New Guinea that his work might one day be on display in the Met in New York, he'd be thrilled. He'd be absolutely proud. The voice of the artist, never mind the communities 100 years or 300 years later, the voice of the artist is never heard when it comes to provenance issues. The opinion of the creator of cultural objects is really imagined. Do artists and artisans want their items shared only locally, or would they rather have worldwide recognition? Of course it's the latter. Almost all artists crave recognition, and only rarely are items made deliberately for a limited local audience. Another reason why museums hold the cultural artefacts of others is because it's in order to protect those artefacts. In order to protect them, it's best not to geographically concentrate them all in one spot. Geographic diversification reduces the risk of catastrophic loss. Now, if all of Aceh's historic objects had been in a state museum in the capital, Banda Aceh, for all of the Achenese people to enjoy and so on, today we'd be in a position of having no Achenese objects left in the world, because the total stock of Achenese artefacts would have been wiped out in the 2004 tsunami. A similar example, of course, as is well known, is the Taliban's administration of Afghanistan. In 2001, the Taliban decreed that all images of humans were idolatrous and must be destroyed. So, the Taliban officials went to the National Museum in Kabul, and around up to 2,500 objects were subsequently destroyed by the Taliban. They went from case to case to case, got the curators to pull out anything with figurative art that was either Bactrian or Gandharan, and they smashed them with mallets on the spot. And no dealer would have done that. So when it comes to preserving art, who's responsible? Now, another attack on art collecting and art history relates to elephant ivory. As I said earlier, the slaughter of elephants to fuel the modern demand for ivory is really disgusting and quite a tragedy. But it's also the case that ivory has been used in art for thousands of years and has nothing to do with the modern illegal ivory trade. It was used in art when elephants were plentiful and elephants were used for their meat. Until last year, antiques that include antique ivory could be imported into and sold within the United States. But last February, the Obama White House changed the rules, and now it's largely impossible to legally export even antique ivory to the United States. Overnight, this ban wiped out millions of dollars in private wealth because it's now a lot harder to sell ivory even within the United States, antique ivory, and it's removed from active circulation many important and ancient artworks. But how is legislation shaped in the United States? Well, that's very clear by the shape of this legislation. It's now illegal to import a 300-year-old Indo-Portuguese salt cellar made in the Congo, but it's not illegal to import an elephant head and tusks as game trophies if you are an American and you're a game hunter and you killed the elephant yourself. So money talks in the United States. Unfortunately, the hunting lobby in the US is better organised and better funded than the museum curators lobby. And look at the results. So you cannot take into the States a Christian ivory produced 500 years ago, but you can take in a tusk if you killed the elephant yourself yesterday. Now, at around the same time, I hate using that term, Prince William was quoted in the media as saying that all the items in the royal collection that contain ivory, no matter how many hundreds of years old they might be, should be destroyed. Now, there are about 1,000 such items in the royal collection that contain antique ivory. Now, of course, it's little wonder that Prince William would want to profess such an interest in endangered species, probably because he's one himself. But the one thing I didn't notice Prince William attacking was the hunting aspect of the US ban, because, of course, he's a hunter himself. So the ivory ban is yet another threat that dealers and museums face at the moment when it comes to protecting our cultural heritage for the benefit of art history and so on. So to summarise, dealers play a big role in the preservation of art history and cultural artefacts. They help to create a market for such artefacts, and this means that such objects come to be preserved rather than discarded. There are problems with looting and so on, but to guard against this, museums are in danger of going too far when it comes to insisting on provenance proof, so far in fact that they end up harming rather than helping to protect our cultural and art history. When it comes to provenance, it's time to declare all cultural and art items innocent until proven guilty, rather than the other way around, and this will widen the scope of what we can protect. Thank you very much for listening.
Excellent. Will you take questions?
Yes, I mean, that was fairly direct, so if anyone would like to have some direct questions.
Please raise your hand.
Yeah.
Can I ask, generally, the relationship between dealers and the auction houses? Is this a comfortable one, a competitive one? What's the nature of it?
Oh, I like the auction houses very much personally because they make so many mistakes that I can make a lot of money out of their mistakes. Yeah. They bring to market a lot of objects that I probably otherwise wouldn't see. And so we comb their catalogues and so on, looking for, because they're essentially like conveyor belts, that they basically need throughput. There are a lot of stuff, and it has to go through, and they make their money out of volume. And so they're not looking at stuff carefully. It means that a lot of items go through which are fake and which have been amended and played with and so on. But it also means a lot of items go through which are not properly researched. And so we essentially pay our central London rent from the mistakes of the auction houses. I personally don't have a problem. There's always a lot of stuff. Dealers often complain about the commissions and so on. I have no problem with this form of business operating and so on. And all I can say is that we do very well out of them. I bought today, in fact. I was trying to work out what was more stressful today for me, whether it was giving this lecture or that I might miss out on 2 objects at bottoms today. But I got the 2 objects, so that's good. But I guess the point is, even here in London, it's quite possible to find stuff which is from the auction houses where they haven't given it the right attribution. And again, a lot of the staff are not very well paid in the auction houses. It's already glamorous until you find out what they're paid. And the managers are really after targets. It's all about meeting targets. And the targets are not about being curatorially excellent, it's about simply getting revenue. Whereas dealers have a lot more time to research objects and to consider them and so on. The other difference between, of course, auction houses and a dealer is that if I have an object, I generally own it, whereas the auction house doesn't own it, so they don't care as much. Yeah.
There's a concern with provenance beyond 1970 images, just to when an object is looted, because they're also concerned that it's something like forgery. There's an awful lot of that about.
Yeah, forgery is a different matter. You have to work out and satisfy yourself that it's something not forged, and it must have the right provenance. I didn't talk about faking and forgery. That's could be like a whole different series of lectures. But I personally don't find that a big problem, because in what we deal in, we generally know what we're doing, and so we're not often tricked. And generally, forgery is a problem if you don't have a lot of knowledge. And so we tend to research so much and go over things so much that it almost makes it part of the fun. But there are, I mean, there's an incredible lot of faking and so on. But I think curators have to, well, I think essentially when you sell to a museum, you would sign an indemnity anyway that this is not a fake, or that if they have to come back to you, they legally can. And of course, under normal law, in this country, if you sell a fake and you sell something that isn't what you've described it, then you have to give a refund anyway, just under trading legislation.
Yeah, Michael, you made a very powerful and strong argument for the cultural benefit of dealers and collectors, the morality of their work, which I can agree with quite a lot of it. But as an archaeologist working for some 40-odd years in Southeast Asia, I've seen another side of it.
Yeah.
Sites which have been looted, dug over, thought to provide material for the trade.
Yeah.
Temples attacked, sculptures hacked off, mutilated to go into the market and go overseas.
Yeah.
So there is another side of it.
Mm-hmm.
I agree with many things you say, that who owns the material is almost unimportant to me compared with the care of the object. But you've rather skated over this question of the damage, the physical damage to archaeological sites. And to me, context, of course, is very important.
Yeah. I agree with that in terms of the destruction of existing sites. If it's under the ground, it's not as interesting, but if someone goes and defaces a temple or something that was just simply beautiful and should have been left, that is appalling. And in our gallery, we tend not to deal in stone, for example. And last year, someone presented me with a lot of Angkor Wat type sculptures, which were not provenance, and they came from a European collection. And I just said, I'm not touching them under any circumstances, because I would rather see them in Angkor Wat. So I think that, I mean, the point you raise is very valid. My point is that a lot of later material, which shouldn't be caught under these rules, are being caught. For example, I gave the example of the teapot and so on. So I think maybe what needs to happen is that museums need to be a lot more sensible, but I think at the moment curators are almost too frightened. They're so frightened for their career reputation, they will rather knock something back because the provenance isn't complete, rather than to sort of say, well, hang on, we don't really need good provenance for this object. We do for a stone sculpture from Central Java. We think it's important. But for other items, it's not so necessary. Another problem with archaeologists, which is what in the Kuno book is often referred to, is that they're terribly precious about they have the right to dig, they have to do this, they have to do that, but they don't publish their results. And so this is the biggest problem. So it's almost a form of cultural theft, in my view, when you say, well, only I can dig this up and only I can do this and everyone else can go away, I'm doing it. And then 15 years later, they still haven't published or disclosed what they found. Now that is a crime as well. So
I would accept that, and I've been guilty of something like myself. But you said, you just mentioned things under the ground. I've seen sites which looked as if there could have been archaeological sites, burial grounds in Cambodia, in Thailand looks as if they're scenes from the First World War.
Yeah.
Unbelievable destruction. And yet these are sites which are crucial for the documentation of many aspects of the transformation of Southeast Asia. Something like 40 or 50 bronze drums just went into the market or were broken up or scrapped. I've just written something about this. Can I send a copy of it?
Yeah, please.
I would
Yeah.
actually like some comments on it.
Okay, I'll comment. Yeah,
It's not published, but
Yeah.
it's in press.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, I think what we're really talking about are questions of degree. And I would say at the archaeological end, or when it comes to that sort of material, we should be more careful and have more requirements for proof of provenance. But for later material, it's not necessary. But the trouble is the later material, the sort of stuff that I often deal with, is getting roped in and being treated as if it's archaeological. And that's the problem. But also, I still think it's a great pity when something very interesting pops up and we don't know that it's looted, but we assume that it is. And that's the problem as well. Yeah, Leslie.
I have a textile question. You talked about artists and signatures and people who make things, and generally in Indonesia certainly, when textiles are made, nobody knows who made them. There is an organisation in Bali, who some of you may know of, who are now working with the islanders in eastern Indonesia, and textiles are made, you know who made it, you know who dyed it, you know who tied the threads. Now these are being sold at good prices, and the artist gets good money. Now as time goes on, 50 or 100 years from now, if you found a textile like that still has the tag on it, and I keep the tags on the ones I have, versus one that has nothing on it, would you generally as a dealer value something with a name on it because you knew exactly all about it versus one that might be 100 years older that you know nothing, for example?
If you had two which were made at the same time and one had the tag, well then of course the one with the tag is much better. Because I mean I love research, I love it, and really love it. And so on our website we put all of the research and so you know we could go on and on and on about who this person was and so on. So it gives us something, it's almost like a selling point. And that sort of history makes it more interesting to a private collector and to a museum, and we can make more money because of it. So we would protect that. I think it's interesting, going back to the who owns cultural property, with that sort of textiles, for us to say in 500 years' time we come across some of those textiles and say, oh no, that must be returned to Indonesia. That's so not what the makers of the textiles would want. And they'd love that, you know, that sort of material to be on display all around the world. Anyway, I'm not sure if that answered the question.
Further discussion, I think.
Yeah, okay. Yeah.
I was just going to ask your personal opinion. As an art dealer, you will sometimes find objects which is quite different from its original form, like you said, because one of the objects you mentioned before was about a silver container with its tray, and you found out that one of the collections in the British Museum didn't have the tray. As an art dealer, would you rather try to find the missing tray and make it as a complete set and deal with it, or just deal the ones as required? Because I think it's quite.
Yeah. Okay. So the question is, if we find something that is incomplete, would we rather find the rest of it, put it together? And I suppose the chances often of finding things like that and putting them together are often quite small. But I'm trying to think if I've ever come across two parts and put them together. I don't think so. I suppose you would, but then I like to sell, so I'm often would rather just research it. I'm not very good at putting things away. I like to sell things right away. And the reason why I like to sell is because I like to buy. And if we sell, it gives us more money to buy. I'm very acquisitive because I love to research, and then I can look at more, keep researching stuff. And if I keep getting more stuff through, it's more stuff to look at and to learn, and I love the learning process. But I suppose ideally, yes, if you could complete something, like by finding a tray that goes underneath, let's say, that perfume box, that's ideal. I mean, we were very fortunate to find that tray with the box, because it became very clear that the two belong with each other. and remarkably have been with each other for about 300 years. They haven't become separated. Whereas I can imagine with the British Museum example, it almost certainly had a trade. But what happened was that the British set up a prize committee at Seringapatam, and they divvied everything up. And then probably someone got the top end, and someone else got the tray, and so on, assuming that the tray and the topic were even brought to the prize committee together in the first place. But in terms of like art history and so on, it was fabulous to get those two items together remarkably last year. And then I contacted people at the BM and I said, look, you know, we've got a tray. You haven't. But they came and had a look at it, and they were really interested to see. And they said, yes, we now know that we should probably have a tray. And that box is quite famous in the British Museum because it's one of the few things that is almost certainly identifiable from the looting of the palace, of Tipu Sultan's palace. There aren't that many objects. The Victorian Albert Museum has quite a few objects, which they always assume are made in India, but I think most of them are trade items. And there are several items which are Chinese looking, and they say, oh, they must be made in China, but I actually think they're probably made in Batavia, where there was a big Chinese community. And I think that often Southeast Asia is underappreciated for what was made there in the 18th century. And a lot of things now are in the British Museum or whatever and are attributed to China, when in fact I think they were Southeast Asian Chinese who did the work. And this is almost another pet topic of mine, that at the moment a lot of, this is totally irrelevant, but I'm going to indulge myself. The market for Chinese export silver has grown immeasurably in the last few years. All of the items made in China were exported. And about 15 years ago, you can come across mainland Chinese who would look at Chinese export silver and didn't recognise it as being from China. And they'd say, oh, it's not ours, it's nothing to do with us, I've never seen this in China. But that's because it was all exported. And so now, over time, people in China have realised, oh yes, this is what we made, and now they're buying it back and exporting it back to China. The trouble is, an awful lot of Chinese silver was made in Southeast Asia. And to me, it's quite Southeast Asian, but it was usually made by Chinese silversmiths, and they very often put Chinese marks on the bottom. Now, a lot of dealers, even here in London, will look at these items and say, oh, it must have been made in China, because it's got Chinese marks and so on. And they're totally underestimating that the number of Chinese silversmiths operating in Southeast Asia who are making things for local clients, and therefore the things are quite influenced by Southeast Asian requirements. And also the number of centres of production. You have to look at sort of Rangoon and Thailand and Bangkok and Vietnam and Singapore and Malaysia and Indonesia, and all of these places had Chinese silversmiths who were producing ostensibly Chinese silver. And the trouble is now, mainland Chinese are going through auction websites and so on, buying up this stuff, thinking it's Chinese, and the dealers and the auction houses often don't know any better, buying it up and they're importing it back into China, where it's going to completely lose its context and be thought of as Chinese, when in fact it's probably from Bangkok.
It'll be identified later.
Sorry?
I said you can make a career and more money by being able to...
Yeah, no, well, we do, yeah. It's one of the things we do. Yeah.
Just another question on the provenance. It just came to my mind that last year and then Cambodia received 2 sculptures back from the metro in New York. The question would be, where are you on the UN law? Don't you think that this law could exist to protect this sculpture so that it could return back to its own country?
If items have been illegally removed recently, they should go back because you're breaking the law. But if we sort of wring our hands and sort of say, oh gosh, these things have been here for 60 years and really we should send them back because that would be nice, I think that's crazy. I don't think things should be sent back. They much better off in encyclopedic museums. But you know, the National Gallery of Australia got into trouble with a dealer in New York, who kept selling remarkable objects over and over and over, and I said to them, you know, does lightning strike once, twice, 10 times, 15 times? How can one dealer have such an incredible quantity of fabulous material, who is obviously ethnically Indian, has great connections back to India, remarkably has all this Indian material? And they kept buying from the one dealer over and over and over. And now they've had to return one object already, and there'll be more. And a few other museums have a similar problem with the same dealer. This dealer is now where he should be. He's in jail in Madras awaiting trial. And again, if you break the law, that's it. But my problem is if something turns up in, say, Scotland, in say, a sale in Edinburgh, and it's a Cambodian bronze or whatever, and it just appears like it must have been there for you know, and then often they don't know where it's from, or they sort of say, oh, it's an Indian sculpture or an Oriental sculpture, and quite clearly no one has any recent knowledge of where it's come from. That suggests that it's probably been here since colonial times, and we should accept that as provenance until we find out proof that it's been stolen from somewhere else. That shouldn't be grounds to reject it from being acquired by a museum, because if we do that, we're going to lose a lot of things. And my problem also with the British Library, for example, failing to acquire enough manuscripts is equivalent to destroying them, because these manuscripts are not commercially valuable enough, and they're being lost. They go back out and they just disappear, and they probably should be protected. I think that's probably enough. So thank you very much for coming.
A lot to think about. We do have some refreshments I'm going to pull out in a second. So if you'd like to stay for a drink and chat, that would be fantastic. Also, I want to mention that next Tuesday at 5:15 p.m. in this very same room, we'll have a talk by Susan Conway on time magic and manuscripts. Thank you very much.